Hi everyone, my name is Alicia, and today I am very honored to have Albert Mhangami from Zimbabwe, who lived in different continents and has an extensive academic background. In this dialogue, we talked about sub-Saharan Africa, the challenges faced, and how the social structure might be one of the most pressing challenges faced, the future of Africa, as well as I love this so much, a practical set of ways of how I, as a global citizen, can grapple with this complex notion. I consider this as one of the most important conversations to have today, amidst all the noise and the hype regarding social issues, racial issues, and addressing the polarity that we're all balancing. Do we choose to be politically sensitive, sometimes too politically sensitive, and we're so comfortable with what we know, but then risk choosing ignorance over education? That is one question that we all need to think about, and I think this helps us with addressing some of that. So, before we start, a huge shout out to our mutual friend Christelle who told me about Albert. I'm very grateful that we actually got to have this conversation. For now, let us dive in to the podcast. I hope you enjoy this one. Hi Albert, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good too, thank you. Let's start with the podcast. Would you like to tell me a short introduction of who you are, including your passion and your areas of expertise?
So my name is Albert Mhangami. I'm from Zimbabwe, but I've lived and worked in the United States, the Netherlands, and now in Beijing in China, and of course in Zimbabwe, where I'm from. My current studies are in Chinese politics, foreign policy, and international relations. But my previous education is quite extensive. I studied philosophy and criminal justice. I have a degree in European law with specializations in human and legal decision making, as well as business and law. But right now, my main research and focus is on regional structures, particularly SADC and its interaction with China and the EU at Tsinghua University School of Social Sciences.
Very cool. You have a lot going on there. There's a lot of different branches. And may I know very briefly the direction you want to go in the future?
So that's actually a very tough question. I think it's always got to do with what I think would be the wiser move. In general, my main passion is about finding a way for Africa to be able to basically achieve the goals set out by the AU as well as different regional organizations. And that's particularly building each region at a time. And so mine right now is the Southern African Development Community. Whether that means continuing my research or working in the field is a difficult question to answer. And at this point, I think there's a little more research I need to do before I enter the field. But so far, that's what the future looks like.
So, based on your strong knowledge across like all these different fields, like legal, you have philosophy, politics, and you mentioned that you want to sort of come up with solutions for the future. So I'm curious, from your point of view, what are the most pressing challenges in sub-Saharan Africa right now?
That's a very good question. I think it's really difficult to answer that because it depends on who you are, where you are in Africa. So if you are in Mozambique, or in particularly northern Mozambique, you are really concerned about extremism and control of natural resources. Whereas if you are doing really well, for example, in Western Ghana, and you're not as hard hit by the economic troubles that are going on, and you're actually seeing more and more community development with the return home sort of mandate, you might be finding concerns about how to interact with people as priorities. But I think on a continental level, the main concern has to be COVID. How do we deal with COVID-19? So this week, I think we reached around 2 million cases for COVID, which is about 3.5% of cases worldwide. We have around the same percentage, I think 4%, when it comes to deaths to COVID. So by most studies actually are saying Africa is doing relatively well. It's actually not that exceptional in comparison to our rise in cases. It's something that is actually really, really well done, especially when you take into consideration that most of the cases in Africa are concentrated in about 5 places. That would be South Africa, the triangle of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and then finally Ethiopia. So the real challenge that's happening when it comes to COVID-19 is very different in Africa. It's not necessarily the lives that are really a priority, which is concerning because there is that conversation of lives versus livelihoods. It makes Africa's situation a fairly different one, a fairly unique one. Because what we're really facing, our main challenge is pandemic fatigue. So now that countries are really trying to find ways to push their economies again to get people back into the job market, jobs are gone. There's a lot of problems. The economies are facing a lot more depressed activity, and that means governments can collect less taxes. And when governments have to collect less taxes, that's already a big problem. But Africa has the unique situation of its debt sort of dynamic. And I'm not an economist, so I won't really go into that in too much detail. But basically, the structure is Africa's debt is normally blown out and said that it's just phenomenally wild and out of hand. But most economists and most studies will show you that it's not necessarily a problem. It's about in the late 50 percentile of our GDP as a continent, which is not terrible. It's actually the main problem actually has to do with a disparity between the debt Africans can afford and the financial capital it needs for the continent to function. And so taking this into account, taking how heavy these economic decisions are and how debt plays a role into it, we're not necessarily concerned about a debt crisis like in the 1990s. Right now, our main focus is about how African economies can survive 2021, because there's a lot of unstable social structures. And with jobs that are really missing, with lives that are already lost, African countries have to restructure 2021 far more wholesomely and far more roundedly than a lot of other economies in the world.
Okay. So, about the debt dynamic, because you touched on that and how it is about debt they can afford. And that reminded me of a lot of the things going on with the Belt and Road Initiative. Like, there's a lot of talks around the debt trap. Do you think that weighs in any form?
That's a very good question. Once again, I'm not an economist, but I can tell you that from a social sciences perspective, at least from the data that we know, when it comes to China, for example, so there's different debt traps around the world. And it matters if you're talking about a debt trap internally in a country. So, for example, how people stay in poverty individually, but on a national level and on a continental level, there has been conversation about China as the new leading investor in Africa. How does China create these loans, and does it result in a debt trap in Africa? Most of the data shows us that it's not the case, that actually the relationship with China, as well as its different entities in Africa, and how they're practicing or creating infrastructure, there's not really a debt trap per se. And it actually, a lot of power rests in African countries and how they can address this, because they have experience. The European experience has really created a more robust sort of perspective on debt. And the population is, as you can imagine, a lot more skeptical. But that, I think, ties into, I think it was Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. There was an article a long time ago about how China had seized some sort of assets and sort of made it really difficult for those countries. But the truth was, it wasn't that case. It was actually a political transition, and it became a more complicated story. So China gets painted very poorly when it comes to the debt conversation. But the main issue in that problem is African agency. When people discuss the debt trap, they make it sound like Africans don't have economists. They make it sound like African people are not aware of when they're being tricked or that they walk into these traps. And this is not problematic when it comes to everyday citizens because the average person is not very much economically educated. But it is a problem when it comes to talking about a continent and talking about entire national economies. So I think that that's always a good question to ask, and the response is normally much more passive than it should be when it comes to the conversation of the debt trap.
I see. Very interesting, because we had discussion around Belt and Road Initiative and how it affects different regions. Like debt trap was definitely something that came up a lot and was like a justification of why Belt and Road Initiative shouldn't continue. And we were using so many like African countries as examples. So knowing this context from you, it's very helpful in trying to understand how the media landscape works, how things are not entirely laid out. We don't really know the big picture of it. You also mentioned that the real problem is how to survive 2021, and it involves restructuring the social structure.
Yes, yes.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, that's actually where my area of focus is, and I really like that you brought that up because so outside of COVID, even before COVID, Africa has had a much bigger fight, a much more crucial fight, which is its identity issue. So the war vets in my home country of Zimbabwe, I'm called a born free. So it's a very strange term to say to anyone else, but a born free is someone who was born after the liberation struggle. So after having to fight for independence from Rhodesia, from the colonial powers. And so I have a very different mindset from the war vets who eventually became rulers and politicians in Africa. And so the traditional concept of what an African politician is, of what a society is, has largely been based off of the dynamic of ruling that was created by war veterans. And so now that their generation, the very last sort of flickers of their generation are sort of, as a lot of them have contributed quite substantially, literally their lives into providing the continent's freedom, an entirely new generation steps forward. And it's a far more complex generation. It's probably one of the most complex generations in the world, because this is a generation that understands colonization and understands the pre-colonial ethical dialogues or ethnic dialogues. For example, they know that there is conflicts between one ethnic group and another, and they know it was interrupted by colonization. And how do they progress in a post-colonial world? They have blackness identity issues. They're considered black, but their skin is brown. How do they address that? They have cultural dynamics that are fighting versus globalization. They have entirely new types of African citizens. So these are different people that are voting. These are different people that are demonstrating. These are different people that are fighting and learning. So there's an entirely new diaspora of Africans as well. And so this identity is probably at the crux of what will make 2021, what will make Africa going on to 2060. This is probably the most crucial generation.
Okay. So you mentioned about the born free generation, and that is from which year, like specifically, like people born after?
So that actually is a very tricky question. Depends on where you are. But
Okay.
as a general concept, it would be anyone born after the 80s, so the 90s kids onward.
Right. And there is an emergence of a new generation, and you mentioned it's very complex. So can you give us some idea of how it might look like?
Well, I think
like different types of people.
That's actually a very good question. So I think a good example is a comparison between. I can give you a personal comparison. So my father and I are very different people. My father had a very different life in comparison to me when it comes to dealing with, for example, racism. So my father, I remember one time I was in a fight or something had happened because someone had said something racist to me and was literally fighting with me because I was black. And, my father and I are sitting in the car and we're discussing this. And my father is laughing at me because I was like, that was racism. And he's like, that's not racism. You don't know what racism is. And so I was like, what do you mean? And so he understood racism from an institutional structure. My father considered racism when he first came into the capital city and was walking in a part of town where it was only for white people. And civilians, not, soldiers, not the military, civilians chased him and wanted to kill him because of the area. So that dynamic,
Oh my
that
God.
I know it's crazy, the difference with what we see is worth fighting for. So for him, he's like, oh no, I just wanted to be, treated as a human being. And for me, it's more than that. It becomes a more complicated question of, it's not just surviving. That's not my concern. Surviving is something that I can understand. I can understand that. But for me, it is a more complex question. What is a human being? How do you live out your life? Um, when I see another person, when I see dead bodies, black bodies in the ocean, between Africa and Europe, when I see people really struggling with poverty, when I see people making amazing businesses, when I see people dying from preventable diseases, and it largely has to be concentrated on people who look like me, with skin color like me, then for me, that's more important. This is a conversation that is far more aggressive for me on every front. And so I'm not alone. There's an entire generation that has these complexities that, for example, sees a white person and sees an equal. When they see an Asian person, they see an equal. And so this generation also has an entirely new way of seeing the world. They have the internet era, what it means to have a phone, what it means to talk online, what it means to post content online, sharing the human identity. This is a completely new way of seeing the world.
Right, right, right. And I think whatever you said there, it ties into actually the next question that we want to address. So, what is it about Africa that everyone should know about? And I think what you said there, about how there's this entire new generation that thinks differently and works differently. What do you think people should be conscious about? What does the rest of the world need to?
That's a very good question. Well, I am tempted there's always this this sort of common conversation of Africa is not one country. Africa is very massive. You could fit all these countries in there. Africa is not underdeveloped. It's not, all of these sort of conversations. And I feel like it's always kind of patronizing, because if you don't know this information, then you probably don't know a lot of other information. So trying to shove that information into someone else's face is, especially in this era of the internet, in the information age, ignorance is a choice type of conversation. But when it comes to Africa, I think one of the key things is, if you consider yourself a cosmopolitan, or at least a cosmopolitanist. So what I mean by that is a person who believes that our first allegiance is to humanity. And so the border structures that are drawn around us, these nation systems, are an organizational structure, there for organizational purposes and not for identity and value. So just because you live in one place in the world doesn't mean your human dignity and value changes. And so if that is really important to you, then when you look at Africa and you see the challenges and the growth in Africa, and you're concerned about these things and you're excited about these things, know that you're probably not as concerned and probably not as excited as Africans themselves. And it's a very harsh statement, but it's a very important statement, because it really thrusts the conversation of agency into this dialogue. So whenever I discuss with people about Africa, they want to be like, yeah, I really feel like, I'm sure you feel like that, and I think it's important you do, but I can guarantee you there's someone who feels far stronger about that in Africa, or in Africa's diaspora.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, thanks for sharing. By the way, I haven't thanked you for sharing the part about your personal experience. I think that would be very helpful in helping people like me to understand what actually goes on, that when we try to generalize or when we try to say we understand something. It's far from that. It's far from that. And I think that is something that we all need to be conscious about. Where do you think the future direction of Africa is? And again, I do realize that when I say Africa, it is covering a very complex area. But generally speaking, if you could tell us more about it.
I think it's a fair question. I know you know about the whole country system and the massive requests, which is why I appreciate you allowing me to sort of work through the answers. But the future of Africa is very interesting. I think that for me, I'm biased because I am very pro-regionalism. I'm a Pan-Africanist. And so I really believe that the future of Africa is largely tied to African identity. It's a question of, so I recently was on a panel discussing this about these complex layers to what it is to be African. You know, you're painted black, you have these colonizational aspects, you have these ethnic things you have to work with, you have these borders that you didn't draw. And so there's plenty of room for conflict, there's plenty of room for division. And then the AU, as well as many African scholars, brilliant African philosophers, come up with this idea, which is just really smart. And it mirrors the idea in the European Union. Up until 1960, the idea of war in Europe just seemed like a constant. Europe didn't seem like it would ever grow. It would just fight itself until at some point it would just be tired of fighting and then start fighting again. It was just such a perpetual cycle. But then the European Union was formed. And so you have Monet and the others who like step forward and they're like, if we bind our economies together, even when we think of the ECC or EEC, the European Economic Community, so EEC. So when we think of them and we think about how that was bound together, how you can tie Germany's resources, the Rhine, the entire conversation, bind Europe together, and war doesn't become an issue. Progress becomes the focal point. And so the same thing is happening in Africa. There's this sort of mirrored, it's not the same, it's a mirrored sort of conversation about regionalism, where Africa by the AU is divided into 5 blocks, which is North, South, East, Central, and West. And Southern Africa, for example, is considered to be one of the most stable places. And how that is formed is the key. What type of regions are we going to create? Do we separate electoral power from the nation structure and put it in a regional body to make elections more credible? Do we allow nations to trade within themselves? Do we make sure that when a person says, I am South African, they are taking into account the multiple other groups around them? And do we say the chieftaincy structure? Do we say these ethnic structures when someone says they are Zulu and Ndebele, and the Ndebele, especially the northern Ndebele, bleed outside of national borders quite proficiently? So when they say these things, the regional infrastructure really makes this possible, and it makes it more cohesive. Binding the economies of Africa together is a very difficult task. I know the ECDPM, for example, which is the European Center for Development Management, they put a lot of strong sort of conversations forward in this regard. They say, this is a very big task. And African nations, like, we know this is a very, very big task. And so that's really the future of Africa. Can Africa pull off this regional structure?
That is, again, a very interesting take, because I've never, well, firstly, I know that a lot is going on, and it's a very complex thing to grasp. So I've never really dived into like, okay, what is next for Africa? What I know about Africa usually is about what China is doing with Africa, or with whatever that's on the news. But I think another thing that we all should be, again, conscious about is there are a lot of internal things that are not outwardly projected. So I think this discussion has been very, very helpful. Act as the starting point of understanding of Africa. Finally, what is the message that you want to bring, and what would you recommend for people to find more information on this.
Well, also thank you. I really like the questions you've asked. It's really nice to have questions that are really more applicable. They're more contextual. So I really appreciated that. In regard to a final message,
Thank you.
I don't necessarily have one. I think I have more in terms of recommendations, I think, for people to engage in. So, for example, most of the time people recommend books. And I'm like, if you are a reader, if you do enjoy sort of stories to contextualize and to explore the story of Africa and its people, I think maybe a good sort of set to look at would be like Titi Dangarembwa and Chinua Achebe. Their books, like I'd recommend Nervous Conditions by her and Things Fall Apart by Dr. Achebe. Those are really good places to start if you're a reader. If you're someone who likes more information that's through video or through conversation, I think the Center of Pan-Africanist Thought has amazing sort of seminars, different YouTube videos. Their YouTube collection actually is really good. It's a really great place to really explore what it is to be African, what is Pan-Africanism, what's the future of Africa. You can also go to their website, which is definitely a great place to start as well. If you're someone who's just, there's people who love Wikipedia and they get down these Wikipedia bunny trails. They just go down and down in these cycles. A good starting point would be Patrice Lumumba. If you just find his wiki page and you just follow wherever it leads you, you will definitely end up with good conversations. Also, if you want to go really far back, if you want a historical context, you can start with the Mali Empire, explore Mansa Musa, find your way through. And finally, and this is always important, I feel like it's definitely a conversation that I tend to push. If someone's reading this or if someone's listening to this podcast and they're in a tricky position because they find that their friends or their news feed is giving them slight hints, and I say that in the kindest way, slight hints that may be ignorant, like dangerously ignorant or racist. If that's the vibe that they're getting from their news feed or friends, it might actually be better to just search a rapper, artist, author known as Akala. He is amazing, and he's actually perfect for these type of conversations because he has this book called Natives. I think it's Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. I think that's the title. And he has interviews. It's literally just search him anywhere. Right. And he's kind enough to not call people out too harshly, but he's structured and strong enough to sort of drag people past guilt dynamics and denial dynamics for purposeful dialogue on race and Africa. So that's what I would recommend for anyone who's listening.
That has been extremely helpful. Yeah, I will, personally, I will dive into some of these. I'm very interested. So thank you so much. And yeah, this has been such a great conversation. I think a very important one as well. As we know, a lot of things are going on. It's, again, when you talked about the option to be ignorant, I think that's not an option anymore. I think people should get involved. And I think many people are trying to grasp what is going on. But we don't know how to, or don't know what is the right way to grasp with it. So sometimes things might come across as insensitive. So all these information that you have shared would be extremely helpful for everyone who's listening and for myself. So I want to thank you again. If there's anything you want to add, feel free to.
Oh no, those are very good questions. And I wonder if I left out anything. I hope I haven't. I know normally I do a lot more with numbers and dates, but I feel like those can be a bit overwhelming for someone who just wants to know, a general sort of introduction or conversational point when it comes to the continent. So I hope my answers were helpful.
Yeah. Thank you, Albert, and have a nice day.
Bye.